It's just unacceptable for the governor to behave like this, to basically use this great office of governor of California and the people of California as a plaything for his political aspirations. It is demented and it needs to stop. Hello everyone, welcome to the Steve Hilton Show. Great to have you with us. Some important updates from Susan Shelley in a moment about what's going on with San Francisco and the National Guard, and an amazing conversation with Shiloh Marx. You know Shiloh Marx, he's fantastic. He's been working on the issue that we know has been plaguing us for years in California, which is cleaning up the voter roll. So stay tuned for that conversation. But I want to start with something very simple about Gavin Newsom. I've said this before, I'm going to say it very directly again now. Gavin Newsom should resign as governor of California because he is clearly not interested in being the governor of California. He is focused almost entirely on his next job that he wants, president of the United States. It's perfectly okay for people to run for president. That's America. Good for him if he wants to run for president. But other people who've had that ambition and have a serious day job have been able to combine both. Gavin Newsom seems incapable of doing it. And now Californians are suffering as a result. And I particularly want to make this point in connection with what we saw over the weekend with the closure of the I-5 freeway down in Southern California, because that was an example of how Gavin Newsom's presidential ambition is now directly hurting Californians. Up till now, you could have said it's just annoying. It's just irritating. We don't have a governor in California. We basically have a social media manager who's spending his time putting out dopey posts on X and trolling the president and putting out merch, all the things we've been talking about over the last few months, as Gavin Newsom has completely flipped, by the way, from where he started the year, which was saying, oh, we're Democrats, we have to listen. We lost the last election. We have to understand where people are coming from. He started his new podcast. First guest was my friend Charlie Kirk, Steve Bannon. And then, of course, the Democrat base, which is the only audience it seems Gavin Newsom cares about, threw up all over that. How dare you talk to the devil, Steve Bannon? And so he just did a complete 180 from that to now totally demonizing, dividing, the worst kind of partisan insult politics. Just pathetic to see. And obviously he says we're just copying Trump, but you're not doing it very well. It's a pale imitation. It's not funny. It's not interesting. It's just embarrassing. And he himself, Gavin Newsom, seems to be completely losing it. Just if you watch him, there's something wrong. I don't know what's going on with him. Just the way he comes across. You can see it in his eyes. There's a sort of frenetic weirdness there, the hands and all this stuff, right? And you could have just dismissed it and said, well, it's just embarrassing. It's ridiculous. I've even made a kind of joke about it and said, well, actually, maybe it's a good thing that he's not focused on his job as governor, because when he does his job as governor, it's always a disaster, which is why we've ended up with the worst outcomes on absolutely everything that matters here in California. The highest unemployment rate, the highest poverty rate, the highest cost for gas, electricity, insurance crisis, homelessness crisis, the water situation, everything a total disaster. The worst school results, on and on. Worst business climate, massive, investments that should be coming here going to other states. So you could say, well, actually, perhaps since when he does his job, you get these terrible outcomes. Maybe it's good that he's just spending his time as a social media manager. But honestly, it's just gone too far. Here's what happened with the I-5 situation. And there's a lot of argument over the weekend over this, but he really did something appalling, which is purely to try and make a divisive partisan point against President Trump, to troll President Trump and to blame him for something. Gavin Newsom closed the I-5 freeway. And you can say, well, who cares? It's just the closure of a freeway for a few hours on a Saturday. I've spoken to people who were directly affected by this. Weddings disrupted. It's a Saturday. Parents who couldn't get to their kids' sporting matches. Businesses losing thousands of dollars worth of business and so on. So and that's just the ones that I've heard. This is the main way of getting from Orange County to San Diego. There aren't really good alternatives. And he did it why? Because he wanted to blame Trump for the chaos. This was Gavin Newsom's Bridgegate. It was a partisan stunt, a political stunt, trying to pin the blame on President Trump for disrupting Californians over alleged harm that could have resulted from the celebration for the 250th anniversary of the Marines at Camp Pendleton. That's this Marine base that's been there. Anyone who's driven on that freeway up and down will know what I'm talking about. Right there on the ocean. It's been there over 80 years. Again, I've spoken to people in the military who were there. Every single day you have there in Camp Pendleton, and it's been there for decades, were exercises using live munitions. But Gavin Newsom said, oh, they're using live munitions for this 250th commemoration, this vanity commemoration for the Marines. J.D. Vance was there, Pete Hegseth was there, and there's live munitions being used, and it puts Californians at risk, and so I'm going to close the freeway. It's total BS, a complete lie. He started off trying to blame Trump for the closure and said the White House has demanded the closure. That wasn't true. That was a complete lie. You can see the tweets and posts from the press office and from Gavin Newsom, his statements saying that it was all the Trump administration who wanted to close the freeway. That's a lie, just brazen lying that we are paying for as taxpayers. This is just out of control, what we're seeing from Gavin Newsom. The White House never requested the freeway be closed, or the Secret Service, or the Department of War, or the Marines, and anyone at Camp Pendleton. No, it was Gavin Newsom who ordered it in order to cause chaos and then blame Trump. And real people suffered. And you just got to say, when does this end? It's just unacceptable for the governor to behave like this, to basically use this great office of governor of California as and the people of California as a plaything for his political aspirations. It is unacceptable. It's unacceptable. It is demented, and it needs to stop. I don't think it will stop. I think he will do more and more of this, because actually the feedback loop for Gavin Newsom on this is crazily a positive one, because the only audience he cares about are these far left activists, the base, because he wants to position himself as the leading antagonist of President Trump. That's why he's doing outrageous Prop 50. We don't even get into that. Rigging our elections. It's all about his presidential ambitions. Nothing he does now is about California. And he's got over a year left on this job. He can do a lot of damage in a year. And it's damaging for us here in California to have a total governor in name only, where he's actually focused on running for president, trolling Trump, and dividing us in the process. So he should step down, do the decent thing, the honorable thing, step down as governor, focus on what he really wants to do, which is run for president and constantly divide us and attack President Trump. We have a perfectly good lieutenant governor, Eleni Kounalakis. She would step in. Of course, I don't think she'll make the changes we need in California. She's a Democrat, but at least she cares about California. At least she'll be focused on the job. I think it's time for Gavin Newsom to step down. I really do. Joining us now with some important information you need to know about big stories happening in California, Susan Shelley. Susan, tell us the latest on this really, just seems to be getting worse and worse. These settlements in Los Angeles that have been opened up thanks to this piece of legislation, just the cost of this seems to be just mounting. What's going on?
It's mounting, and it seems to be riddled with fraud. What a shock. There was a bill passed in the Assembly Bill 218 in 2020, which removed the statute of limitations for I believe a 3-year period, so that people who had sexual abuse claims going all the way back to the 1950s from being in LA County facilities or school facilities in California, they could file claims for damages. And the attorneys who wanted to take advantage of this were legion. And the LA Times reported just recently that there were people who were down on basically the Skid Row area. They were in LA trying to persuade people, paying them to lie and say they were abused, or paying them to file claims. And everything was John Doe and Jane Doe, because it's sexual abuse, so you don't have to put your name on it. And these attorneys were filing the claims. LA County ended up agreeing to a $4 billion settlement. And now they've just added another $800 and some million in an additional settlement for additional claims. But because of these allegations of fraud, they're going to question every victim who seeks compensation. So here's the way this is going to work under this bill. The lawyers get their money, but the victims have to wait for the funds to be allocated by a commission that's going to assess all the claims. And now all the victims will be interrogated with forms to fill out about their experience to try to separate out the fraudsters, who themselves are victims, who were just impoverished people being paid to fill out a form or say something, and they didn't think they were doing anything. And so these lawyers are going to cash in. The taxpayers of LA County will be in debt for 30 years or 40 years for the bonds to pay this $4 billion settlement, and all because of this reckless legislation, which, if I'm not mistaken, Jerry Brown had vetoed once before, but Gavin Newsom signed.
What's the connection between the commission and the amount of the pot of money, the settlement money, and the laws and the legal process?
Well, it's a class action suit. So how do you determine who gets the money? It's not individual claims saying where they're doing them, they're negotiating them each separately. So there is a plan for some sort of a commission that will review the claims and allocate.
So the settlement
award.
has, so they've conceded the lawsuit. That's over. They've
over.
agreed.
They've agreed.
So this is not a process where one side has put forward an amount and then it's going to be haggled through. No, they've agreed the $4 billion and now nearly another billion. So it's like nearly $5 billion.
Right. Nearly $5 billion.
They've agreed to pay.
They've agreed and they've approved it. Oh. I think the $800 and some million dollars has not yet gone through the full approval process, but the $4 billion did.
And just to be clear, I know we've talked about this before, but like there's so many of these stories. This is the city or the county?
This is the county.
Okay.
But I believe
so the Board of Supervisors agreed this?
Yes, the supervisors agreed to this, but there are many other situations in government-run facilities where there were sexual abuse allegations. And I'm not minimizing the allegations at all, but this is an odd way to address the problem where you're going back to as early as 1959. There are no records, there are no witnesses, and they're going to try to pay claims to people based on what exactly? And that's what this commission will have to figure out.
And when is the bond going to be? I mean, does the bond have to be voted on?
No, the bond doesn't have to be voted on because it's a debt that's owed by the county. So the voters don't have to approve it. They owe the money and they can borrow to pay it.
And has that been issued? Is this all now the train's left the station? This is happening?
This is happening. I don't think they've issued the bonds yet, but this is happening.
And so 30 is taxpayers on the hook.
Right.
Wow. And Newsom signed it. But Brown, that's interesting detail. Brown vetoed it, Newsom signed it. And the lawyers, I mean, the more that I look into the different policy fiascos in California and the massive failures as a result, lawyers are behind a lot of them. I mean, I've made the argument that if you look at almost, I mean, I don't want to be, too sweeping, but almost everything that's gone wrong in California are going wrong, where we have the worst outcomes in the country on pretty much everything that matters. And this is why I make the argument that we need change, political change, because there are underlying almost everything. You have three structural forces that are present. Number one, and it's coming from the Democrats. Number one, the climate ideology. Number two, the unions, who are the biggest donors to Democrat politicians. But actually, number three, the lawyers, who are the second biggest donors to Democrat politicians. And so they keep passing all this legislation that benefits lawyers. And that's why we're not just the most over-regulated state in America, the most over-litigated as well. So many of the things when you talk to businesses and why everything is so expensive, why it takes on lawsuits, endless lawsuits. And it's all as a result of legislation that favors the lawyers because they own the politicians.
And the courts are very overloaded with civil litigation, so it's very, very slow to get any kind of a decision out of the courts, which means it's very expensive. So a business can be shaken down by the threat of a lawsuit, and they can settle very quickly just to avoid the legal expenses, which can be very abusive.
Oh, and so the lawyers are going to get paid here how? They're going to be paid out of the bond money?
I think they get as up to 45% of the settlement. 33 to 45% of the settlement is what I read.
And they get that first, and then the victims have to wait.
Well, the LA Times reported that the DTLA law firm that is accused of fraud by the Times is requiring 45% of any payout. So that may be the deal that they made with the people who were making the claims, that they would take 45% of the payout. And the Times reported that DTLA said its fee structure is entirely standard within the industry. The Bar Association says typical fees are 33 to 40%. So that's a lot of money out of $4 billion that the lawyers are taking, and they won't have to wait 30 years for their money. They'll get their money, and the taxpayers will be paying for a long time.
It's a shakedown, all of it. I mean, and the other thing, just to tie it back to an area I've done a lot of policy work on, the PAGA lawsuits, private
Yes.
attorney general act, that plague pretty much every business. That's a shakedown. The lawyers take their cut first, and then when you get finally the settlements, the employee who often it's exactly the same. It's kind of fraud, actually, where the lawyers go and they get these cases that are made up, often the tiny sort of infractions of labor law, and the employee who's bringing the claim, urged and often like engineered by the lawyer, they hardly get anything, because the lawyer gets the first cut, and then I think 75% goes to the government,
Right.
to the state government. It's just
And this is so
outrageous.
sad because people who were in these county facilities, these juvenile facilities, whether they were care facilities or they were in the justice system or whatever they were, if they were sexually abused, these are not people who had tremendous resources behind them to fight a situation. So these are people in difficult situations to begin with, and then they're being preyed upon by lawyers, and now the county's going to treat them like fraudsters to see who's real and who isn't before the money gets out. And the whole thing is just, it could not have been more badly handled if they had tried to create the worst possible structure for it.
All right, let's move on. The second story today, that you it's a national story, but obviously very closely tied to us here in California. San Francisco, National Guard. President Trump said, "Yeah, we're going in." What's happening?
President Trump said he's going to send troops to San Francisco to clean up the streets because the city's not safe. He said about 15 years ago it went woke and now it's a disaster. And of course, Gavin Newsom is very touchy about that, San Francisco being his particular area of expertise. And yet the White House points out that San Francisco was cleaned up just fine when the president of China was coming for a visit, but for the citizens of San Francisco, not so much. And the president is absolutely taunting Gavin Newsom, and Gavin Newsom is taunting the president. And we're watching a reality show happen here. Meanwhile, the courts are stepping in, and the courts are saying that the president can't command the National Guard, which is absurd for a U.S. district judge to say, I'm going to take control of whether the president can send troops to Illinois or Texas or California. I'm going to have rulings, and we're going to fight this out. This is crazy. Eventually, it'll all get to the Supreme Court, which is very busy because everybody's challenging everything. And they're going to have to say the president's the commander in chief, and a federal judge can't say whether the president's judgment is correct or not. That's just not the structure that we have, where Article 3 gets to tell Article 2 what to do.
Before we get to that, and the kind of the federal role here, I do want to make a point to everyone, um, that there's a yes, there's a layer of the problem in San Francisco which you could argue is municipal, and it's just inadequate local attention to proper law enforcement, just not enforcing the law, just badly run. Okay, so grime and squalor and filth everywhere, and of homeless encampments all of that. And so you could say, well, that should be local, county, whatever. And San Francisco is the city and county of the same boundaries, which is quite unusual for California. But then there's an aspect of this which is undeniably federal, which is international drug gangs in San Francisco. There's a guy called Tom Wolf, who everyone should follow, T Wolf Recovery on X. I know he's fantastic, not particularly partisan, not at all partisan, really. I was with him on day 2 of my campaign on the streets of San Francisco. He makes the point that for over a decade now, you have at any one time, this is his numbers, between 500 and 1,000 professional drug dealers operating freely on the streets of San Francisco, fentanyl dealers, and from Honduras, most of them. And there's a town in Honduras, Syria Valley, I think it's called, which is basically financed by the drug trade from San Francisco, to the extent that the whole town is covered in San Francisco memorabilia and 49ers flags and all this. So of course that's no different to the boats that are being blown up in the Caribbean.
Well, it answers the question of who can afford that real estate, doesn't it? You have to be involved in one of these trades that's all cash, I guess, to live in San Francisco comfortably, because people in California are not making the salaries that pay for the real estate in California, and it's becoming a huge issue. And of course, regular businesses can't operate on the streets. You can't have a storefront restaurant on a street if you've got homeless and gangs and people just endangering everyone on the sidewalks. You're not going to have customers coming in and out for theaters or shopping or dinner. And so the economy of the city begins to circle the drain. And that's what's happening in so many cities.
So what is the legal, let's go back to the legal argument, the district judge. So the argument that you hear is the National Guard commandeered by the president can only be used for national security related things, not for local law enforcement, with the exception of DC, because it's a federal District of Columbia. But everywhere else, you can't use the National Guard for local, what to substitute or step in where you have failing local law enforcement. What's the truth of all of that?
Well, the president can send National Guard troops to protect federal buildings and federal employees doing their job. So he can send reinforcements, essentially, to help ICE and the Border Patrol and the FBI and anybody else who's being threatened by people in the state. He absolutely can do that. And this judge who just ruled in the Illinois case said they weren't endangered enough. She questioned the president's judgment on how badly they were injured, how many were injured, no one was killed. And she was making this argument that it wasn't serious enough. And really, if you think about the structure there, that a federal judge is saying the president's judgment of what's dangerous is not correct. How much information does a judge have compared to the information that the president has? And should a president have to please every federal judge in the country before making every decision about protecting federal employees and federal assets? I think
And
that's
there
really
it was
kind of crazy.
relating to ICE operations, was it?
Yes. In Chicago, it's related to ICE operations. They've been under siege by protesters and rioters. And the president is making a very interesting political argument to the American people, demonstrating that it's a matter of will whether these cities are safe or not. And in the Democrat-run cities that are not safe, he is showcasing that policing can make the cities safe, which is a really remarkable thing. In a lot of ways, he's doing a bit of reversal on what the Warren Court did in the 1960s by doing crime suppression instead of emphasizing the constitutional rights of criminals or accused criminals. He's going back to suppression. It's like, let's not let that crime happen and then fight about it in the courts. Let's suppress the crime from happening in the first place.
Exactly. Well, that's what people expect from government. You want order and safety, and it's like the basic thing.
We vote for it again and again. We just don't get it.
And I just think it seems to me, I don't know, I'm the legal story here. Maybe you can add some detail, but going back to, let's just, San Francisco and the fact that it's international drug gangs operating on the streets from Honduras, criminal gangs, international.
Right.
Isn't that obviously, therefore, grounds for federal action?
It certainly would seem so. And certainly the federal law enforcement authorities can operate in any state in the union. The state governments can't stop them from enforcing federal law in the states. This is the argument over the immigration law, that it's federal law, and the states can't have sanctuary from federal law and prevent the enforcement, which is something that they don't get in Los Angeles. They're arguing as if there's some sort of a city right, not even a state's right, but a city right to resist federal law enforcement and hound them and denounce them. And this is horrendous, because they're dehumanizing the individuals who are working in law enforcement. These are people, and they're dehumanizing them, and they're normalizing violence and hatred against them. And this is coming from the leadership.
Yes, and then they passed that law about the doxing thing, that they can't wear masks, even though they forced all of us to wear masks. Anyway, the thing that I just want to say is on in terms of the local, well, we have to watch it. We'll see what happens. But the most amazing thing I saw, well, the local leadership has just been pathetic. First of all, I mean, I was out. I went on Friday to show people. You can see it on my X feed, just a random street, and you see the open air drug market, and that's block after block. I was there on Friday. I showed you. I stood there and said, like, the local leaders in San Francisco, the mayor and the DA and the police chief and the board of supervisors all said towards the end of last week, and they're repeating it over the weekend, we don't need federal help. Everything's under control. It's such an insult to everyone's intelligence when you could see the problem right there.
It's almost as if they're being paid off by drug kingpins and gang leaders. It's hard to see how it would look any different if they were all being paid off by criminals.
Well said. Susan, thank you very much. Great to see you as always. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, Steve. Great to be with you.
Joining us now, someone who I've gotten to know over the last few months, who's doing absolutely incredible work for us here in California on the voter rolls, which have been a disaster for so long, but getting better. And he's here to tell us all about it. Shiloh Marx. Shiloh, it's so great to see you. For those who don't know Shiloh, you should. He's on, I've seen you on X, and that's where we first got connected. I was watching you post these amazing updates on cleaning up the voter rolls in California. I thought, who is this guy? It's very interesting, and I reached out and we got connected and we've been talking. But I'd love you to bring everyone up to speed on what you've been doing. It's an amazing story. So just tell us the story. How did you get into all this? Why are you? Well, tell us a little bit about who you are and where you are, and then how you got into the whole question of California's voter rolls.
Yeah, I'd love to. And that actually does remind me. So when I first started jumping ahead, when I first started posting to X, I was so excited, Steve, that you had followed me and started liking the post because it was, to me, what was happening was monumental. And so your support, even from the very beginning, was huge. And so thank you for that. And that, but so now to jump kind of back into how I got into cleaning the rolls. I think it was about 3 months out from last year's election, the 2024 election. I was working with a group that was working on election integrity nationwide throughout 7 states. And so I kind of got involved with voter rolls and election integrity through that. But then after the election, I started doing more research on my own, which then led me to Judicial Watch and their infamous lawsuit in LA. And so what I found out was that the 1.2 million removals that Judicial Watch was able to get, I found out it was plausible because removals were something that very few people have ever been able to actually accomplish. And so I ended up just basically taking the settlement agreement from the Judicial Watch lawsuit. So after 5 years litigation, it led to a settlement. And through the settlement agreement, there was what they called a series of progress reports. And so it asked specific questions. I ended up putting that into an individual record request and sent it out to 57 of 58 counties in California. And kind of the rest is history.
What form did it take? You sent a letter to the registrar, is that right?
Yes, yep. So the 12-page document titled "The Statutory Notice of Violation of USC 20507." So that's just the NVRA when it comes to voter list maintenance.
What is NVR? Tell us the background. What's NVRA?
Okay, so in 1993, Congress passed what's called the National Voter Registration Act of 1993. And it had 4 purposes. The main was to basically get as many people registered to vote as possible. And then the last 2, or kind of the lesser of the purposes, is to maintain accurate voter rolls. And so through that legislation, that is where there's basically kind of a window where states are not allowed to remove voters for all intents and purposes. And so after 1993 was then you had the creation of the inactive voter. And so federal law basically said, you guys are allowed to remove voters. And again, this is on the heels of the Voting Act of 1964 and kind of the gerrymandering. And so the federal government wanted to make sure there wasn't any illicit practices as far as removing or purging voters. And
Right. So
so
just to be clear, that was intended to stop. So the 1993 provisions in relation to removing voters was intended to stop um, unjustified removals. Is that right?
correct. Yeah. As best as I can tell, it was basically because the unjustified removals, um, and I'm fairly certain that's the Shelby v. Holder, where there was a lot of legal, I wouldn't call it warfare, but just through the decades where you actually had very very bad practices from southern states, and so the judicial branch actually kind of got into, I think there was 12 states that were not allowed to pass any election laws without first running it past Department of Justice. And so through that, yes, to answer your question, in 1993 was kind of saying, hey, we want to get as many people registered to vote as we can while protecting against basically purging people without, I don't want to call it due cause, but yes.
And so to connect that to what's been going on now, so is that the basis on which the Judicial Watch lawsuit was filed? Could you just
In
bring it
part,
to that conversation
yeah.
about, you're talking about the window for removals. Just explain that.
And so in 1993, it basically, you had the first time where federal government mandated essentially a 4-year window where states could not remove. And so fast forward in 2018, 2019, when Judicial Watch started litigation with LA County, what had been found out was LA County, where essentially every 4 years you're supposed to remove voters, had not been doing that for many, 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 many years.
So
And
so the law
so,
was you're allowed to do it after 4 years, or you have to do it after 4 years.
great observation. It's you are so in 2018, Husted v. Phillips was a Supreme Court case where it mandated that. So it, states aren't states aren't allowed to kind of, that's not discretionary, it's mandatory. So after 4 years, they must be removed.
If they're inactive.
Yes, if they, the prereq is that they don't, the first one is they do not return a confirmation notice. And most of the time it's considered just an address confirmation notice. And then fail to vote in the subsequent 2 federal general elections. Once those two are met, that is where a voter is, per federal law, required to be removed. And
So
so,
just to be clear, if you don't vote, if you haven't returned I mean, I'm registered to vote. I voted in every election that I've been able to since I became a citizen. I've never done anything other than vote. I haven't sent anything in to say yes, I'm reg. So that confirmation thing, what's that? That sounds a little weird.
great question. And a lot of this is so confusing. And so, what I like to do is explain it. It kind of gets nitty gritty, but so to answer your question, when somebody moves out of the jurisdiction, there's a series of triggers and flags. And so the first is usually the NCOA, the National Change of Address. And so, for instance, I'm in San Diego County, but I used to be registered to vote in Riverside County. So what Riverside County will do, or what they're supposed to do, is they will send a address or an address confirmation to my previous residence. If I don't respond, i.e., I don't live there anymore, then that sets the clock. So then now, if I fail to vote in the subsequent 2 federal elections, Riverside should remove me.
So that's on the count. That's so interesting. So how did they know that you've moved? What's the process?
So when with the national change of address, when somebody gets a new address, that basically flags or creates a trigger to send to the registrar of voters. So they say, hey, this person moved,
So who's
and
the
then,
they? Who's sending that? I'm just curious. The
no, great question.
national change of address. What is that? Is that some bureaucracy somewhere?
Yeah, basically, I don't know who's, I'm pretty sure it's the post office, United States Post Office, uh, where, because yeah, I think so, because you when you, I've never done it. I've just, people I've heard go into the post office and change their address.
So what's supposed to happen is that this national organization, you think of as sort of function of the post office, sends a notification to the registrar, directly to the registrar, and then the registrar is supposed to send an address confirmation to the current address or the former address? And if you don't get a response, in what time? What's the deal? Is there a time limit?
It differs from state to state. Now, when you look nationally, those confirmation notices that are sent, 61% go back as what the EAC reports in the United States Election Assistance Commission reports as status unknown. And so the big issue is basically when Congress passed this in 1993 and to where we are now, it's just a completely different system how we kind of do day-to-day practices, which including the post office. And so the problem is it is complicated, Steve. That is the biggest issue. Prior to the NVRA, California's last election code that governed this specific thing, which is removing voters, it was a 30 or 45 day window to answer your question of when you could remove somebody. So there wasn't a 4-year wait, and a county could just send a address confirmation notice to somebody. If they didn't respond, then California could remove them. And so basically there's so much I don't want to call it red tape, but there's so much governing policies and procedures.
Yeah, and just generally a rule in life that I've experienced in business and in government is that the more complicated you make something and the more bureaucratic you make something, and actually the more centralized you make something, the worse it is. So the fact that we got some national change of it, I don't know, this feels crazy to me, but there you are. This is the system. So the new rule is so they try and check whether you're there or not, and if they don't get a positive answer, then they wait and see whether you voted in the subsequent 2 elections. So that's the a presidential and a midterm, just federal, right? So it's 4 years. And then if you haven't responded to the change of notification address, if you haven't voted twice in a row, they have to. And you're saying since 2018, they have to remove you, not just they can remove you. So they have to remove you. Is that correct?
Correct. Exactly right.
Okay, very interesting. So that's the law. And now bring us up to speed on the process you've been following around all of that, what you've been doing personally.
So that last part right there, where it's didn't return a confirmation notice and then failed to vote in the subsequent 2 federal elections. That's one of the questions that I've asked every county. When they respond to that, they're giving me the total number of people who need to be removed. So
Wait. So you're asking them what question?
I'm asking them because there's 8 questions. It's gotten longer, but there's 8 questions. And the third question goes into ask how many voters are on the county voter rolls who received a confirmation notice and then did not vote in the subsequent 2 federal elections.
That is the definition of an inactive voter.
Kind of. So the an inactive voter, which and this is literally why it is so complicated. The word in the term inactive voter is not defined in federal law. That was not defined in the National Voter Registration Act of 1993 or the Help America Voting Act of 2003, HAVA. The inactive voter is actually defined only in 2 places: the Federal Code of Procedures, and then it's called the implementation of the NVRA of 1993, written by Congress. And so, inactive voter, that is a term and definition that the federal government gave states to basically define on their own. So that's where it gets super complicated because federal law only defines 2 voters, eligible and ineligible. An inactive voter is at the state's discretion. For all intents and purposes, an inactive voter is just somebody who has not interacted with the state agencies to confirm they still live in that address, if that makes
Right.
sense.
Right. But the haven't voted in 2 cycles thing, that makes you ineligible, does it?
Bingo.
What? Why? I'm curious about that. Some people may be registered to vote but choose not to vote. So what? Doesn't mean that they should be taken off the voter rolls.
Yeah, well, and I agree with you 100%. So and the Supreme Court ruling, it basically in 2003, after the Bush v. Gore in Florida, there was kind of a big debacle, and so they call it they need you need a fail-safe way to vote, and so you can't remove people just for not voting, and that's why there's a lot of people. Santa Clara County has 200,000 people that have not voted in 10 years, but they've responded, so you don't get removed solely off of the basis of not voting.
Got it. Okay. But it seems to me that the responding to the address confirmation is a bit of an unreliable procedure. I mean, what if you just
Absolutely.
what is it in the mail? Is it?
Yes.
I mean,
Yes, it's
we
in the
all know
mail.
the amount of crap that comes in the mail. And and if I mean, I'm just imagining what it is, one of these sort of cards, and oh my gosh, you got all this junk mail, and here's another piece of junk mail. I'll just throw it in the trash.
A I would. I mean, it's and they call it it's called the D2 confirmation notice, and it's just a little card that has specific wording that if you do not return, that's the trigger for the subsequent 2 federal elections.
Okay, so then you're writing these letters. You with the 8 questions to the registrars, and number 3 is how many voters are in this category, didn't return the thing, and didn't vote in 2 elections. What were the other questions? I mean, what are you asking them?
The first is how many active voters are on the voter roll? How many inactive voters are on the voter roll? How many voters have been made active in the last year? The fourth question is I go on to ask what voters that meet this requirement have not voted in the past federal, the 2, 4, 6, 8, and I think, or no, 2, 3, 4, and 5 federal elections. And then I ask them about the confirmation notices, and go into detail of that. And so um, it's kind of complicated, but I'm speaking the language of the registrar of voters, specifically as Congress outlined it.
So you've been sending these letters, and do these letters have legal force, or you're just sending them as a interested citizen?
Interested citizen. Yeah, there's literally nothing behind it. It doesn't serve as a pre-suit notice. And to be honest with you, when I use the term statutory notice of violation, it's technically incorrect because I would have to allege first, and then somebody would have to basically say this is a violation.
So you're writing them these letters, and you're saying statutory notice of violation. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. And
How can you, a concerned citizen, issue any kind of statutory notice for anything?
great question. I think there's zero enforcement behind it other than I include the past 6 years worth of the county's self-reported data to Congress through the EAC. So what I say is, here's how many confirmation notices you've sent. Here's the response of the confirmation notices. Here's the inactive voter totals. Here's the active voter totals. And here's the removals. And so it basically paints a big picture where you just see these gaping holes. And so to answer that correctly, other than being a concerned citizen, it's simply an allegation.
And you're sending it. So when did you start sending these letters?
January 21st, I believe, was the first time I did it. The San
This
Diego
year.
County. Yep.
Okay. And then what happened?
Then San Diego responded to me, which this is the best part, Steve. I've never done a records request. I had no idea how to do any of this. I was just
It's,
flying by
just
the
to
seat of my pants.
started with San Diego is your home county.
Correct.
It
Yes.
just makes sense to start there.
Yes. It because when I looked at it too, in 2018, San Diego had 800,000 inactive voters. And so I was like, there's got to be a way to clean these. And so yeah, in January I sent it, and California has a window. It's a 10-day window that counties have to respond to me by 10 business days to fulfill that the CPRA request was just a records request. And so, to my surprise, I was actually in Costco, and there was 45 minutes left on the business day. San Diego responded, and I was floored. I was absolutely floored, Steve, because I was like, why are they responding to me, let alone in this very formal fashion? And so San Diego went on to explain in great detail that since the Judicial Watch lawsuit, because the Judicial Watch lawsuit essentially updated the California Elections Manual, stating that that's not discretionary anymore. It's mandatory. And so San Diego basically told me there's 109,000 voters that we are sending out a notice to, and then if they don't respond, we're going to remove them. And so that was the first time where I was like, whoa, what's going on here?
Was that the end of your engagement with San Diego?
It was, yeah. They let me know that they had identified the exact amount of people who met the requirement, and then they were in the process of removing them. And so I followed up because, and this is the hard part. If I try to play hardball with counties, which by the way, most ROVs just don't like me, but I think it was about a month later, I followed up with San Diego in a records request and basically stated, are those done yet? And where are you at? There's kind of a back and forth that they either can play or they have. So it's kind of this weird thing I had to learn. And so it took about 4 months, I think, until San Diego actually confirmed that they had removed all of those.
And so, just to be clear, is it the kind of story here that they were doing it anyway, but you chasing them kind of made them get on with it and report publicly on it? Is that the right? So you didn't initiate the cleanup, but you kind of, I don't know, hustled it along. I mean, what's the right way to characterize it?
I don't know. Um, Facilitate or basically I remind them of federal law, because what ended up happening, San Diego had been dropping. And so, for instance, in 2018, there was 800,000. Currently, there's 100,000. So there's been a massive cleanup in San Diego. But then you had counties that hadn't reported any removals for 6 years. And so those were the counties where um and really honestly, it sounds weird, but I mean it, Steve. I don't want to take credit th- for removing or I'm just reminding counties of what we pay them to do. And so what do you end up having, because I was tracking it county by county, I started to see, okay, here's a trend of counties that have never in the past, which, because I went all the way back. I can go back as far as when prior to the EAC, it was the FEC, and the FEC did what they called the NVRA uh, code books or reports. And so I can go all the way back with county data. And so you just see a sharp drop off uh, this year.
And are they removing them this year, or they're reporting this year on removals that they did in previous years?
Great question. Such a good question. And so the EAC report, and this is also why it gets tricky. It is from end of registration to end of registration. So the report that just came out is from the end of registration 2022 to the end of registration 2024. And so what I like to say is that yes, those counties are reporting those removals during that period. Period, full stop. Now, every state defines when end of registration is. California, per the Secretary of State, is 8 o'clock, November 5th. But the issue is you can't record or report provisional ballots until they're done being casted and counted 20 something days later. So the issue that I have, which I haven't spoken about because again, making things more complicated is just a big mess. But yes, to answer that question, those removals and there was 1.7 million removals that happened from people not returning the confirmation notice. And that happened from the close of 2022 to the close of 2024, prior to anything I did.
Right, 1.7 million.
Correct.
And then where are we now? What's the total?
So the 1.7 is removals. What I started to do was track the inactive total voters. So not removals, but the actual net deduction of inactive voters in California. So there was 4.9 million reported to the EAC in 2022 into registration. there was 2.8 million reported end of registration 2024, and today we're at 2.3 million. The hard part, again, a lot of this was trial and error and seeing all the data on my own. You have, because the inactive voters is something every state has, but it's you have a national average, and so the national average is 10.6% of each state's voter is an inactive voter. We have been wildly above that, 2 to 3 times higher, almost since 1996 when the NVRA implemented the inactive status, which today we are, for the first time since 1994, under the national average.
So now let's explain what this means to actual elections and the future of California. Why is it significant that these numbers are coming down in California?
Great question. One, and I would say the most important, is because now California is in line with following federal law as it pertains to voter roll and maintaining accurate voter rolls. Full stop. The second part is, if you think that California elections have been either a little bit off or maybe skewed or slightly manipulated, then that begs the question, which is, how do they do it? And so this is the part that, and I don't have to go into great detail, but in order to manipulate elections, you actually need a valid voter registration. So the NVRA define it's a registrant. So just basically someone who's got the ability to be on voter roll and is an eligible voter. When you look at the data going back to 1993, Steve, the inactive voter totals start to match the Democratic vote margin of victory. And it happens every election, 15 of 16 elections since 1996, the only one being Arnold, Democrats have won. So my theory, this is a theory to everybody, is that in some way, shape, or form, they have been using inactive voters to either manipulate, affect, or, for all intents and purposes, mess with the ecosystem of California elections. That is kind of my theory.
So the challenge to that would be the change that happened in terms of mail-in voting, because and I think, when you talk about inactive and so on, it's the same. I think people go to the same place, which is there are all these people on the voter rolls that shouldn't be there. And when you combine that with what we've got now in California since the pandemic, which is universal mail-in voting since the 2020 election, where they send a ballot to everybody. And then you combine that with ballot harvesting, which is this insane, where people can go around, sweeping up ballots and helping people fill them out, even though they're not supposed to, and so on. Whether that and the left has been doing that here, the unions and the activist groups. So you put all that together, like ballots going out to people who shouldn't have them, and ballot harvesting. That is the opportunity for shenanigans. But that's quite recent, the universal mail-in voting over the period you're talking about. So what would have been the opportunity for shenanigans prior to universal mail-in voting, specifically relating to inactive voters? What would they have done with them?
Are you talking about before the NVRA or after? Are we talking
I'm
about?
talking about you made the point since 1996, we've been above the national average. And so my point is, like, so what? And your theory is that they've been using that and it correlates with Democrat election victory margins. My point is, like, well, how, given that until recently we didn't have mass universal mail-in voting? I can see the
Yeah.
argument now, right? Because we're
Okay.
sending out millions of ballots, and and you hear all these stories, like you hear all the time. You hear these stories. I'm in my apartment building. There's all these ballots there, and there are people who've died or they've left the state or whatever. So I can totally imagine that, and then you have the ballot harvesting. So I can totally imagine, I think, in a practical way, the opportunity for mischief there. But before universal mail-in ballots, so what that you have enacted, what could they do with that in, like, I don't know, 2004? What could they have done with that?
So in 2004, after 2000, you had the passing of the provisional ballot. And so, not to make it even more complicated, but federal law, HAVA brought about what, again, which is federal, the provisional ballot. And so the provisional ballot was what they called the fail-safe way. So making sure anybody, even if you're not registered to vote, you can come to the polls and you can vote provisionally. And so Florida came down to 561 votes, I think, in favor of Bush. And so in order to I think to answer your question, right, before the mail-in ballots, how do they cheat? When provisional ballots is probably the easiest, which is what, to my belief, in close races, because I found 39 races nationally that were under 30,000 votes going to the winner. And so the issue with the provisional ballot, and this is where it gets really, really crazy. The provisional ballot has a completely different chain of custody. So the provisional ballot is unlike any other ballot. A lot of times people get the provisional ballot and the Ukova ballot and they put them together like they're siblings. Ukova is for people that basically don't live in the United States anymore. Military people, right? That is a completely separate thing. A provisional ballot is when somebody shows up to the poll, says, I'm a citizen of the United States, and so just let me vote, and then basically check it later, like in golf. I'll hit a second one just in case. So the problem with the provisional ballot, because you have to put all your sensitive data on it, it's almost like a HIPAA violation. You're not allowed to see patients information. So that ballot goes into, it's called a secrecy sleeve. Then it has a completely different chain of custody, unlike any other ballots. That goes and gets counted, Steve, and I'm not even kidding. It goes and counted in a room with, it's a locked door. And the most shocking part is, and we saw this in Maricopa County, also in Texas, there has to be cameras of that monitoring where votes are being tallied. Not in the provisional ballot room. It's illegal in most states to have a camera on where the provisional ballots are being counted, not where the regular ballots are being counted. And so, in order to answer your question, before the mail-in ballots, when you look at states that have very, very close races, the provisional ballot is a great way of either altering, manipulating, or changing the outcome of elections uh, without necessarily needing a mail-in ballot. And those are usually close races.
Okay. So let's so
Yes,
where are
and
we
it's
now?
complicated.
Well, no, but
It's
it's good.
complicated. So
Your view is that the information that, and you're putting this out on X and elsewhere, and we're seeing these big drops in the and in the numbers of inactive and eligible voters in California on the rolls. And so your theory is that this could make a big difference in next year's election, in which, of course, I'm running. So I have a great interest in this. So just let's the last question: how do you see this playing out in next year's election?
to answer that truthfully, because I know a lot of the claims on Twitter kind of come across, or X come across bombastic, but that's not my actual intent. There's 9 counties remaining that have not engaged in the removal of the other counties, and mostly red counties. So right now we have San Bernardino, Riverside, Stanislaus, I think is how you say it, Fresno, and then there's one other I'm thinking, but those are the main 4. San Luis Obispo, they only have 23,000. If we're able to remove those, because those are the counties for some, because the biggest question is people go, well, Shiloh, why are they doing it now? I don't know. You have to go ask them. It's not state law, obviously, because all counties aren't doing it. 2 counties outside of LA County have the highest inactive voters, red counties. Riverside County has over 300,000, and Stanislaus 88,000. That number hasn't come down for many, many years. And so why this matters, or to answer your question, how does this affect? I think, and I'll just put it bluntly, I think California's been rigging elections, and they've been doing it in a way that nobody's been able to figure out. We've been looking in the wrong place. They've been hiding in plain sight. So what I believe is the biggest way that they've been using the ability to rig elections is by using me and you, people that are just inactive in previously lived counties. There's not a boogeyman. It's they've been able to procedurally use federal law to make sure that there's a way that they're able to rig elections. And I think that that's done.
It's absolutely fascinating. We could talk for hours about it. I'm sure we will in the future. Last point, then, Shiloh. What's next? What for you the next steps, and then where can people follow you and keep up with what you're doing?
The first part, what's next? It's continuing all the lawsuits, the litigation, and then monitoring all the counties that have done removals. And so that part is we get to bring the big dogs with Harmeet's office and other just great, not just Harmeet's office, but different, very, very good lawyers. But you can follow me on Shiloh Marx, ShilohMarx on Twitter.
Joining us now for our Big Ideas Book Club segment, a conversation I'm so excited to share with you. Someone I've recently met who's written a brilliant book called Rad Future, The Untold Story of Nuclear Electricity and How It Will Save the World, Isabelle Boemeke. All right, so you appointed yourself to the most amazing job I think anyone's ever heard of, nuclear power influencer. Tell us how that happened.
Well, I in 2019, I remember waking up one day and seeing photos of the Amazon on fire and, feeling desperate, wanting to do something about climate change and realizing that nuclear electricity was the only source of clean energy that had a very specific problem, which was a bad PR problem. And I decided to help solve that issue. And one of the ideas I had was to become a nuclear electricity influencer, which, to your point, is a fascinating title.
And so how did you get just to tell us the steps, because there's some amazing things. We've chatted a few times now, and I'd love to share with your audience. Obviously, you've written this amazing book, which I haven't read sort of front to, from sort of in one continuous piece, but I've gone in and out of it, and it's so great, and there's so much incredible content and facts and stories. It's very human. It's a wonderful, wonderful. But that's why I was so excited to meet you, because I've been an evangelist for nuclear power here in California for a long time, but I've never seen anyone put it together so compellingly as you have. Tell us I mean, there's one particular thing that I loved, which is the story of a particular nuclear plant in California. Let's get into that, because I think it's a good example of how you've taken a completely different approach to anyone else in this before.
Well, so one of the things I realized, and one of the reasons why people feel so strongly about nuclear, is because, frankly, they just didn't know about it. The only time people hear about nuclear is when it's on the news. And if it's on the news, it's because something bad happened. So they associate, the word nuclear to bad events, when in reality, it's one of the safest sources of electricity. So the book, as you mentioned, is really just an exploration of history, how we came to fear nuclear so much, even though, again, it's one of the safest sources of energy, and how it works. I try to make it very accessible, very easy for people to understand. And I love that you mentioned jumping in and out, because that's okay. I want people to go in and only read up the sections that they're interested on or want to learn more from. Now, you mentioned Diablo Canyon, and that is one of my favorite stories as well. So, I had this idea of becoming a nuclear electricity influencer. This was end of 2019, beginning of 2020. And the way I did it was I started posting online. I started making videos to try to explain to people how nuclear works. But after a year of doing that, I decided to do something in the real world. And when I looked at all the nuclear plants in the United States, there were five of them there that were at risk of being shut down, not because they were unsafe or because they had to shut down. It was mostly due to politics. And one of them was Diablo Canyon, which is located in San Luis Obispo, which is kind of center of the state, kind of perfectly in between San Francisco and Los Angeles. And I remember when I saw Diablo Canyon, I realized that was the plants that I wanted to focus on saving, because it is the most iconic nuclear plant in the entire country. This is, for those who don't know, this was the birthplace of the anti-nuclear movement. So tens of thousands of people protested, while this plant was being built. There was a famous musician, I think it was Jackson Brown, who was arrested protesting at the gates of Diablo Canyon. Jane Fonda went there, at the height of the anti-nuclear movement. So this was such an iconic place, and I realized that if I could keep Diablo Canyon open, it would send a very strong message, not just to the state of California, but perhaps to the whole world, that people were reconsidering nuclear. I led an entire effort there that started in 2021. I organized a rally in San Luis Obispo. I wrote a letter that ended up being signed by 79 of the leading climate experts and energy experts in the country, urging Governor Newsom to reconsider the decision to shut down the plant. And the good news is that the plant was going to be shut down in August of 2025. And obviously, we're past that date and it's still open. And the plan is that it's going to stay open at least until 2030. But I have to be honest, this is probably going to stay open much, much longer than that because, as you know, the energy situation in California is not getting any better. So I don't see a reason why we should shut down this perfectly fine nuclear plant.
I mean, it provides about 10% of the energy of the electricity of California. I think I'm right in saying something like that.
Yeah, it provides around, it depends on the year, but around there, 9%, sometimes 8, but around 9, 10%. And not only that, it provides 1,200 very stable, high-paying jobs. The really cool thing about nuclear is that the closer you get to nuclear plants, the highest the level of public support, because the people in the community really see the benefits. You go near in San Luis Obispo, and people are all about the plant because they usually know somebody who works at the plant. They see the benefits to their public schools. They see, again, the benefits in terms of the high-paying, stable jobs. And they know that they're breathing in clean air because they're not right next to a coal plant that's polluting the air. So there is no reason to shut down this plant. By the way, it's also stunning. It sits on this beautiful piece of land. The vast majority of it is just conservation land. So it's pristine. It's really a stunning plant.
And so let's talk about the safety thing, and the myths around that. Just give us the basic numbers in terms of say nuclear safety, and I suppose the contrast with other forms of power generation.
I mean, nuclear doesn't even compare, right, to fossil fuels, for example. So when people think of fossil fuels, they obviously think of climate change. They think of CO2 emissions or things like that. But even for those who are not concerned about climate, fossil fuels are a huge issue from an air pollution standpoint because when you burn them, they release particulate matter into the air, and we breathe this stuff in, gets lodged into our lungs, and then we develop all sorts of illnesses, that stem from that. And that alone already causes at least 4 million people to die prematurely every single year. Okay. So just to put that into context, we would need about 200 Chernobyls a year, and I'm being very conservative here, for nuclear to be as dangerous as fossil fuels. We would need to see 200 Chernobyls happening every single year. And when you talk about nuclear, people point to 3 accidents that happen over 70 years of an entire industry. When people bring up Chernobyl, and when I talk about nuclear, I say it's like it's the same as if I'm telling you that I'm going on a cruise ship and you say, "What about the Titanic?" You're pointing you're pointing to this one accident that happened in the Soviet Union with a bad reactor design. And so, unfortunately, as I said back in the beginning of this interview, people just have this fear of nuclear that's totally unfounded. And when you look at the data, nuclear is actually as safe as solar and wind, and a lot safer than hydro. And I think that this is something that people are starting to realize more and more because, again, the evidence is just so strong at this point. But let me talk about Diablo Canyon specifically because people have very specific concerns about the safety of the Diablo Canyon nuclear plant because it was built on top of several faults. So they're afraid of earthquakes. And they point to the Fukushima accident, which happened in 2011 in Japan. And what I like to explain to people, and this is something that I looked into because I wanted to make sure that I was advocating for something that was safe, right? And so the Fukushima accident actually wasn't directly caused by the earthquake. It was caused by the tsunami. Now, of course, the tsunami was caused by the earthquake. But the difference here is that the Fukushima plant had a very low seawall. So the tsunami got on top of the seawall and actually inundated the basement, which is where the diesel generators were located. So the plant couldn't keep, cooling itself. Now, the Diablo Canyon plant sits on a bluff that's 85 feet above sea level. If we're going to get a tsunami that can get to that plant, I think we have much bigger things to be
Big
concerned about,
problem. Yeah.
than the nuclear plant itself. But then on top of that, after Fukushima, every single plant around the country has moved their cooling systems to way up higher. So, again, I don't think a 100 feet tsunami would happen in that region. It has never happened. Again, with nuclear, so many of these fears are totally unfounded.
What about, I mean, the other point you make, which is very powerful, I don't think we need to spend too much time on it, but I'd love you to just talk about it, is the point that in an industry which first came to public attention in a very violent sense with the nuclear bomb, so that's probably influenced this to a certain extent.
Totally. If you think about us humans, we really react to things on an emotional level. Just because it's easier, right? So that's the first thing that we can feel. And then we use logic to try and explain why we reacted in that way. But in reality, we're just reacting emotionally to things. And so when you think about nuclear technologies, nuclear fission, which is the process that happens inside of a reactor that produces electricity, was discovered in 1938 in Germany. We were a year away from entering World War II. And so the first use of nuclear technologies was the bombs. And so the image that people associated that word with was mushroom clouds, kids crying, running away from crumbling buildings. You have to imagine that's a very deep emotional scar. And then after World War II, we'd go straight into the Cold War. Kids in America were, doing drills in school where they had to lunge underneath their desks in preparation for a nuclear war. Again, just keeps, deepening that emotional scar. So of course, people have this very negative emotional reaction to anything nuclear. So by the time the first incident happens, which is an accident at the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant in Pennsylvania, even though nobody died from it, even though nobody got sick from it, it was one of those moments where people react with fear and then they say, well, see, this is dangerous. We were right to feel that this was dangerous.
It's incredibly important to understand that if we're going to change that. Um, let's switch gears to the economics of it and the role in our power generation system. Of course, we're going to need so much more power for electrification, for AI, and all the rest of it. So let's look at a country like France, for example, which is probably is France the leading nuclear power right now in terms of electricity generation, and how have they made it work economically? Because one of the other arguments you hear is, yeah, maybe it's good and carbon free, but it's very expensive.
Well, so France is the leading in the sense that the largest share of electricity comes from nuclear, but because they're a much smaller country, in terms of just raw production of electricity from nuclear, the United States is the leader. Probably very soon to be bypassed by China, frankly, because China is building a ton of nuclear plants, and they have planned 150 reactors for the next 10, 15 years. And the United States currently has around 92. So they will soon pass us if we don't get our act together. So people say it's expensive, and I'm not going to lie, it is expensive. That's in part because for 30 years, this was a completely dead industry, if I'm talking exclusively about the United States. For 30 years, we didn't build a single nuclear reactor. So by the time we built 2 reactors in Georgia at the Vogtle power plant, they were first of a kind. And as anybody who has created a product, you know that first of a kind is going to be way more expensive than nth of a kind. So I think the question that we need to figure out here in the United States is, how can we keep building the same design over and over and over to make sure that we can actually get those costs to drop? Because that's the only thing historically, if you look at all the countries that have deployed nuclear at scale successfully, that's what they did. They picked one design and built a ton of them. And it's entirely possible. China right now, as we speak, is building nuclear plants in about nuclear reactors, large nuclear reactors, in about 4 years, and with prices that are competitive with American gas.
So the last thing I just want you to talk about, because it comes up a lot in this conversation about nuclear, you hear it all the time, this acronym SMR, small modular reactors. Tell us about that. Is that real? Is that the way forward? What's that all about?
So one of the ideas that people came up with trying to figure out how do we solve the problem that nuclear is quote unquote too expensive. One idea that has been going around, frankly, for 40 years is that we should just build small modular reactors that can be manufactured in a factory, shipped in the back of a truck, and assembled on site. The idea is that you would avoid a lot of the construction costs, which we know add a bunch to these projects. But I'm going to be very frank. The closer people get to actually building these things, because by the way, none of these companies have built a prototype. Okay, so this is an idea. We don't know that it's going to work. And the closer the companies get to building even the prototype, they realize they're going to need a lot more construction than they anticipated, and that they're not actually going to be modular. So just to answer your question really clearly, the truth is it's one way that they're trying to solve the cost problem, but we have no idea if it's going to work out. So I'm always of the thought that we should, at least for now, start building the reactors that we already have, that we already know work, while we figure if, small modular reactors are going to be competitive.
So basically punch out the design that we know that works, and then you get more efficient and you bring down the cost.
Yes, and if this other designs, the smaller designs prove to be competitive as well in the markets, then great, we can build them too. But we can't put all of our eggs in that one basket.
I said last, but there's one very quick last thing, which is on the small thing. The kinds of reactors you get on nuclear submarines, nuclear powered submarines, is that smaller than the S in SMR? That's like really small because it's just powering one unit.
Yes, it's smaller than most SMRs, but even, the small is debatable because there's a very wide range. And, the thing people love to talk about the submarines, and we've been using small reactors for the submarine for decades, but the military doesn't really have a budget constraint. And you have to remember that when you're talking about nuclear for electricity production, for electricity markets, you're talking about selling something is already a very common good, right? And you have to be able to compete with fossil fuels.
All right. Fantastic. Thank you so much. You're just brilliant. I love this so much. Tell everyone where they can get the book and follow your work and just get involved.
You can buy Rad Future anywhere, really. Not on Amazon today because Amazon is down. But once the server comes back online, you can get it. And you can find me on isodope.com.
Fantastic. Wonderful to see you. Thank you so much for writing the book and for all your work. I think
Thank you
it's
so
such
much.
a huge part of our future. I'm 100% with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's our show today. Hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you follow us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Tell all your friends to watch and listen to the Steve Hilton Show. And of course, please support my campaign for governor. We are building a fantastic movement. We're getting organized with our volunteers. It's all heading in the right direction. SteveHiltonforGovernor.com, FOR, SteveHiltonforGovernor.com. See you next week.